In a fiery and unfiltered debate, Karoline Leavitt takes on a liberal journalist, delivering a masterclass in political discourse. Her sharp responses leave the journalist speechless and the audience stunned. Watch as she dismantles arguments with facts, confidence, and wit. This is a must-see moment that has everyone talking. The room was silent, too silent. Karoline Leavitt sat across from the journalist, her eyes sharp, her posture firm. The cameras rolled, the audience leaned in. They knew what was coming. This wasn't just another political debate. This was war. The journalist smirked, tapping his pen against the table. Karoline, isn't it true that your views are outdated? That people like you are stuck in the past? His voice dripped with arrogance. Karoline didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her voice calm but powerful. Outdated? You mean standing up for the truth? You mean protecting the country our ancestors bled for? The audience stirred. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. The journalist chuckled. Well, facts say... Whose facts? Karoline interrupted. The ones that fit your narrative? Or the ones real Americans live every day? A gasp spread through the crowd. The journalist blinked. He had underestimated her. For a moment, the room held its breath. The battle had just begun. The journalist cleared his throat. Let's talk about fairness. Many say your policies are unfair to certain groups. What do you say to that? Karoline's eyes softened, but her voice remained steel. Fairness? Let's talk about fairness. My grandfather fought in World War II, came home and worked 16-hour shifts in a factory. Nobody gave him a free pass. He built this country with his hands. An older man in the audience wiped a tear from his eye. He remembered those days, the sacrifice, the struggle. Karoline continued, her voice steady. Fairness is not taking from those who worked hard and giving it to those who refused to try. Fairness is allowing people to rise by their own effort, not dragging everyone down to the same level. The journalist shifted in his seat. But don't you think... Karoline held up a hand. No, listen. There are people out there right now, veterans who fought for us, sleeping in the cold. And we're spending billions on nonsense? Tell me, is that fair? A deep silence settled in the room. Even the journalist had no words. A woman in the audience sobbed softly. Her husband, a retired soldier, had passed away last year. He had given everything for his country, and she had watched him suffer. Karoline turned to her, her voice now gentle. Ma'am, I see you. I see all of you. She looked around the room. The forgotten ones. The ones who gave everything only to be ignored. The woman covered her face, her shoulders shaking. Others in the room did the same. Karoline swallowed. She had to finish this. You deserve better. You deserve leaders who fight for you, not against you. And I will never, ever stop fighting. The audience erupted, not in noise, but in silent, powerful emotion. Some wiped their eyes, others clenched their fists. The journalist. He had nothing left to say. The battle was already won. The journalist adjusted his tie. He was sweating now. The debate wasn't going the way he had expected. Karoline Leavitt sat still, unshaken, her eyes locked on him. She could hear the audience breathing, some holding back tears, others gripping their chairs. Karoline, the journalist finally spoke, his voice weaker than before. You talk about fairness, but don't you think that some people need extra help? That the government should step in? She took a deep breath. Let me tell you a story. The room was silent. My father worked 40 years in construction, calloused hands, a bad back. He paid taxes, obeyed the law, raised a family. Then one day he needed surgery, but the system, his own country, pushed him aside. Others who never worked a day in their life got priority. A woman in the crowd let out a muffled sob. Someone's grandfather had lived that same story. Karoline's voice trembled, but she stayed strong. Don't tell me about fairness. The real workers, the real fighters, the real heroes in this country are being forgotten. That's the truth. The journalist looked down. He had nothing to say. The truth was too painful. A man in the audience wiped his face with his sleeve. He had fought in Vietnam. He remembered coming home, broken and tired, only to be treated like he didn't matter. Karoline saw him. She spoke straight to him. "Sir, you are not invisible. You matter." The man's lip trembled. He looked away, trying to hold it together, but the tears came anyway. The journalist cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Karoline, don't you think government programs are meant to help these people?" She turned to him, her voice steady. "Help? Where is the help? The veterans sleeping under bridges, the seniors choosing between food and medicine? Where is the help?" A deep silence filled the room. Some people lowered their heads. Others stared at Karoline, their eyes wide, their hearts breaking. She leaned in. "You can talk about policies and statistics all day, but these are real people, not numbers." The journalist had no words. The weight of truth was too heavy. An old woman in the front row broke down. She clutched a small American flag in her hand, shaking. Her husband had served. He had worked hard. He had believed in this country. But in his last days, nobody came to help. Karoline looked at her, then back at the journalist. Tell her why her husband was forgotten." The journalist opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no answer. Karoline's voice grew stronger. "Tell all of them. Look in their eyes and tell them why they don't matter." The room felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. The audience couldn't hold back anymore. Tears fell freely. Old men clenched their fists. Elderly women shook their heads. Karoline stood up. "This isn't politics. This is right and wrong." The journalist lowered his gaze. He knew he had lost. Not just the debate, but something deeper. The truth had been spoken, and no one could ignore it now. The journalist took a deep breath. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his papers. The debate had shifted. It was no longer about politics. It was about pain. Real pain. Karoline turned back to the audience. Her voice softened, but the fire remained. "How many of you have lost someone? Someone who gave everything for this country only to be forgotten?" Slowly, hands went up. Shaky hands, wrinkled hands, hands that had held rifles in war, that had built homes, that had raised children. An elderly man with a military cap on his head spoke, his voice breaking. "My brother. He was in Korea. He died waiting for help that never came." Karoline nodded. "And now they say we should trust the same people who ignored him, who ignore all of you." The journalist blinked, speechless. The audience was no longer just watching. They were part of this now. A movement. A reckoning. Karoline's voice rose. "The media can spin their stories, but they can't erase your pain. They can't erase the truth." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some whispered prayers. Others wiped their eyes. The journalist swallowed hard. He had never felt this kind of pressure before. The journalist gripped his pen, his knuckles white. He had to regain control. "Karoline, people say you only focus on the negative. What about progress? Don't you think things are better now?" Karoline's expression darkened. "Better? Tell that to the Vietnam veteran outside this building sleeping on a sidewalk." The room gasped. "Tell that to the grandmother choosing between her electricity bill and her medicine." A woman in the second row sobbed into her hands. She knew that pain too well. Karoline's voice trembled, but she stood tall. "Better? My neighbor, an 80-year-old man who worked every day of his life, now has to beg for help while criminals walk free. Is that better?" The journalist opened his mouth but found no words. Karoline shook her head. "The truth hurts, doesn't it? But you know what hurts more? Watching good people suffer while the rich and powerful tell us everything is fine." Silence. Thick, heavy silence. The journalist looked at the camera. Millions were watching. He had never felt so small. A man in the back stood up. His voice was shaky, but strong. I was in Desert Storm. My friends didn't make it home. I see people burning the flag they died for, and no one does anything. Tears streamed down his face. Karoline turned to him. You're right, and I'm not afraid to say it. Enough is enough. The audience murmured in agreement. Some clapped. Some just cried. The journalist cleared his throat. Karoline, don't you think that's divisive? She turned sharply. Divisive? You know what's divisive? Ignoring these people. Telling them their struggles don't matter. That's divisive. The audience erupted. The journalist paled. Karoline leaned forward. You asked for this debate, but you weren't ready for the truth. The journalist looked away. He had no argument left. The room belonged to Karoline now, to the people, to the truth. The room was quiet. Too quiet. The journalist had stopped taking notes. He wasn't ready for this. Then a frail voice broke the silence. A woman in the front row, no older than 70, stood up with tears streaming down her face. My son died serving this country. Her voice cracked. And they called him a villain. The audience gasped. Some covered their mouths. Others shook their heads. Karoline turned to her. Her eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. Ma'am, your son was a hero, and no media lie will ever change that. The woman trembled. They burned the flag at his funeral. They said he was part of the problem. Her knees gave out. A man beside her caught her before she fell. Karoline clenched her jaw, her hands gripping the table. This is what happens when we let lies take over. Good people suffer, families are destroyed, and the ones who gave everything are thrown away. The journalist shifted uncomfortably. Karoline leaned forward. Look her in the eyes. Tell her why her son didn't deserve respect. The journalist looked down. He had no answer. A deep voice came from the back. My best friend bled out in my arms in Afghanistan. The audience turned. A man, tall and strong but with weary eyes, stepped forward. He wore a faded jacket with a military patch. His voice was rough, tired. And now, I see kids who have never worked a day in their lives screaming that he was a murderer. Tears welled in his eyes. His hands shook. He was 19. He just wanted to protect his country. Now his mother has to hear people say he was the enemy? A woman near the front broke down sobbing. It was too much. The pain was too real. Karoline's voice was low, but powerful. We don't just lose soldiers on the battlefield. We lose them at home. We lose them when their sacrifice is forgotten. When their families are told their deaths were meaningless. The soldier clenched his fists. It's not fair. Karoline nodded. No, it isn't. She turned to the journalist. Tell him. Tell this man who carried his best friend's body that he should be ashamed. The journalist exhaled shakily. He couldn't. The weight of truth was too much. The journalist looked at Karoline, his lips pressed together. He wanted to speak. He wanted to argue. But how could he? Karoline shook her head. You came here thinking this was a game. But these are real people, with real pain, and the media ignores them. The room was thick with emotion. Some audience members clutched their chests. Others wiped their faces with shaking hands. Then an old man with silver hair stood. His voice was hoarse. My father fought in World War II. When he died, there was no big ceremony, no cameras, no news coverage. His breath hitched. They only cover the ones who disrespect this country. Karoline closed her eyes for a brief moment, then looked at him. Sir, I see your father. I see his sacrifice. And so does every real American in this room. The old man's face crumpled. He sat down, covering his face as he wept. Karoline turned back to the journalist. This is what you don't understand. This isn't about politics. It's about honor. And you've forgotten what that means. The journalist looked around the room, at the broken faces, the tears, the raw truth. For the first time, he felt ashamed. The journalist looked lost. His hands trembled as he shuffled his papers, searching for a way out. But there was none. The audience was no longer watching a debate. They were living it. Every word cut deep. Every truth exposed wounds they had tried to ignore. A woman, elderly and frail, struggled to stand. Her voice was barely a whisper. My husband. He worked 50 years in a steel mill. He paid every tax. Never asked for a handout. Her lips trembled. Then he got sick, and the government told him he didn't qualify for help. A sharp sob echoed in the room. Karoline's jaw tightened. She turned to the journalist. Look at her. Look at all of them. She gestured to the audience, to the broken faces, the tear-streaked cheeks. These are the people you claim to represent, but you don't even see them. The journalist's mouth opened, then closed. What could he say? That she was wrong? That their pain wasn't real? The silence was deafening. For the first time, he understood. He wasn't in control anymore. Karoline had spoken the truth, and the truth was more powerful than any argument he could make. A man in the second row suddenly stood up, gripping a worn-out cap in his hands. His face was red, his breathing shaky. My father was in Normandy. He never talked about it, just worked hard, did everything right. He let out a bitter laugh. And when he died, we had to fight for the benefits he earned. His voice broke. He gave everything, and the system turned its back on him. People around him wiped their eyes. Some nodded, others whispered prayers. Karoline's eyes softened, but her voice was still strong. This is what happens when leaders forget who they serve. The ones who built this country, the ones who bled for it, are discarded like they don't matter. She turned back to the journalist. Tell him why his father didn't deserve help. Go on. The journalist swallowed hard. His throat was dry. His usual talking points were useless now. The weight of the room pressed down on him. He had spent years behind cameras, pushing narratives. But now, face to face with real people, their pain, their tears, he had nothing left. The dam had broken, and the truth was flooding in. The journalist sighed, his hands shaking. He looked up at Karoline, defeated. Maybe you're right. The audience gasped. Some sat up straighter. Had they heard correctly? Karoline's eyes narrowed. Maybe? The journalist exhaled. His voice was quieter now, uncertain. I don't have an answer for them. He looked around the room, for any of them. A moment passed, then another. The old woman from earlier, the one who lost her son, spoke again. Then why do you keep lying to us? Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. The journalist had no response. Karoline leaned forward, her voice low but firm. It's not about politics. It's about doing what's right. The people in this room, they deserve better, and I will never stop fighting for them. Tears fell freely in the crowd now. The weight of her words settled into their hearts. The journalist, for the first time, looked truly ashamed. And Karoline? She had already won. Karoline took a deep breath. The weight of the room was on her shoulders, but she was not afraid. She looked around at the tear-streaked faces, the trembling hands, the weary eyes of those who had given everything for their country, only to be forgotten. She turned back to the journalist, her voice unwavering. You see them now. You hear their pain. So tell me, what will you do about it? The journalist's lips parted, but no words came. He had spent years dismissing these people, treating them as statistics, as inconveniences. But now, sitting among them, looking into their eyes, he had nothing to say. Karoline pressed on. Because if you won't fight for them, I will. And I won't stop. Not until every veteran, every widow, every struggling American is seen, heard, and respected. A murmur spread through the crowd. A spark of something. Hope. An elderly man clutched his chest, whispering through his tears, Finally, someone who cares. The journalist swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, he realized the truth. This wasn't about left or right. This was about right and wrong. And he had been on the wrong side. A slow clap echoed through the hall, then another, and another. Soon the entire audience was on their feet, clapping, cheering, wiping away tears. The journalist sat frozen, watching as the people he had ignored for so long stood behind Karoline, united. The woman who had lost her son clasped her hands together. "Bless you," she whispered. "Bless you for saying what we've all been too broken to say." Karoline nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm not saying it for me, I'm saying it for you. For all of you, because the truth matters." The journalist rubbed his forehead, his shame visible. I didn't know it was this bad." Karoline's voice was calm but firm. "You never wanted to know." The audience quieted. The truth hurt, but it was undeniable. Then the journalist did something no one expected. He looked at Karoline, then at the people, and he whispered, "I was wrong." The room gasped. Tears rolled down his face. "I see it now. I see you." A miracle had happened. He had finally woken up. Karoline exhaled, looking into the camera. Millions were watching. "This debate wasn't just about politics," she said. "It was about truth. And the truth is, too many good people have been abandoned." She took a deep breath. "If you've ever felt forgotten, if you've ever struggled and been ignored, know this: you matter. Your story matters, and we will not be silent anymore." The crowd erupted. People hugged, wept, clapped. The energy was electric. The journalist wiped his face. He had come to defeat Karoline, but he had been humbled instead. The debate was over, but a movement had begun. Karoline turned back to the audience. "If you believe in the truth, if you want this message to reach more people, do one thing. Make your voice heard." She looked straight into the camera. "Like, comment, and subscribe. Not for me, but for them." She gestured to the audience. "For every forgotten American, for every veteran, for every hard worker who deserves better." She smiled softly. "Let's make sure they're never ignored again." And just like that, history was made.